All right, so today we're going to be going through a lesson on how to write cases and as well as use a software to um, better organize your cases. Before you even start watching this video, if you have not downloaded Verbatim, you should go and do that. It should be under a website called Paperless Debate. It is by far the best way to write your cases and get your blocks and everything you're going to need to be debating and have all your information nice and organized and in one place. So we'll go through in this video and explain why it's so great, but before you even get started, you should go get that so that way you can follow along. But anyway, once you have all that together, it is time to actually just get right into it and start talking about how we can write cases, how we can format them, and how Verbatim is going to help us make those cases the best that they can be. So I'm just going to go step by step and write the case itself. Now, you should definitely, once you have gone to this point, you need to obviously understand how things like arguments are made, because I'm not going to be going into that into this video. I do have another video up that you can go and watch to help you better understand how to write arguments and what the necessary parts of them are. And I'm also not going to be going over researching in this video. I'm going to have all my research already pulled up from an old case I've written. So if you're looking for tips there, this is not your video. This is instead how we can format the case and make it persuasive both when we're presenting it and also have it in a followable order. That way it's not confusing whenever you actually read it in round. So on that note, we're just going to go step by step and pull all this stuff up. So first, before we even get started, let's look at why Verbatim is great and why it's going to help us. So if you go to Verbatim, obviously it's just a Microsoft Word doc, but there are a couple things that are a little different. Notably, if we go under this little debate tab right here, we get all of this different information that normally does not come in a Word document. Quite honestly, I don't use a lot of this stuff. So, for instance, I never have to worry about using the timer because I generally use my own timer or record functions. Most of what is going to be useful is going to come right here and right here. Otherwise, most of this stuff probably can be useful depending on what form of debate you do, but at least during traditional Lincoln Douglas debate, most of it's not going to be something you have to worry too much about. I don't think I've ever hit any of these buttons in my 3.5 years of debating, so it's definitely not like you have to use everything that's on here. So, but what we're going to focus on right now are these functions right here, because most of these, especially these four, the F4 through F7 buttons, are going to help us organize our case and make it easy to read and find what you're looking for, even just from flipping through your paper or scrolling through your case. So essentially, as we move down this list, we get to smaller and smaller fonts and organization tactics that'll make it easier to put stuff all under big ideas. So whenever you start a case, you're first going to hit the F4 button. You can either hit the physical button or digital button up here or the physical button on your keyboard. Personally, I'm going to be using the keyboard button, so if you don't see me go up there and hit it, that's why. But it's going to give us this little box here, and this box is going to be like the head of our case. This is going to be at the very top, and we're only going to use it here. But this is simply where we're going to put our title. Whenever you're titling your case, it truly doesn't matter what you put because you're not going to read it in round. It's generally traditional to put your last name and then affirmative or negative, obviously depending on if you are writing an affirmative or negative case. Personally, sometimes I'll write more than one case on the affirmative and negative side for the topic. So I tend to like to give myself a little bit of a note about what that is. So in this case, as we can see from my little note up here that I've already written, we're going to be writing a case about oppression. So I'm going to name it Oppression AC, AC standing for affirmative constructive or affirmative case. So right off the bat, we just have our first little note up here. That way we have the beginning of our case and we can know what exactly we're working with whenever we open up the case. Now, of course, it is time to get into actual things that we're going to say in round. So generally, I like to break up the constructive speech into three main parts. You have your little spiel at the beginning, which is going to be used to kind of set context. A lot of this is going to be done by giving definitions. I usually like to open with a quote just to give a little bit of style to my case and things like that. They're probably not going to play a big role as the round goes on, but it's a nice opening for your judge to kind of get eased into the round. And then afterwards, you're going to present your framework, your value and criterion, any definitions you need to go along with that, and any cards that you provide to help justify why that value and value criterion is the best in today's round or why they work together. And of course, we're also going to see, hopefully, a bit of analysis after this to explain the cards in your own words. And then lastly, after that, we are, of course, going to get into the contentions or your actual arguments as to why we should affirm or negate the resolution and how doing so is going to help achieve your value and value criterion. The only other big thing that you might have to add is some people like to use observations, which generally I believe would kind of fall into your intro spiel. Of course, they're a little bit more strategic and a little less stylistic than the rest of the intro. And personally, I think they're a little overrated. I think people who think they use observations think that they're being super sneaky and strategic, but ultimately they seem to have very little bearing on the round as time goes on. But if that's the type of debater you are, definitely just throw that in there at the beginning. We will not be showing it in this specific case writing area, but that's what you can do. So let's get started on our little stylistic intro. Like I said, I personally like to start with a quote. For the sake of this, I'm just going to be pulling it from my case, which is right here, but I'll kind of make it clear what I'm doing. So you'll just put in your quotes. Copy and paste that right into the top. Generally, your quote doesn't have to be necessarily from a super qualified source. It depends on what you're working with. So on my negative case, I pulled it from Alana Mercer, who is an author, and she really doesn't have the right to be saying too much about the economy, but it works enough because people recognize that name. Of course, it's always better to get quotes from famous people who have experience, especially if your general judge is going to recognize them. It's always great to get Martin Luther King Jr. quotes or FDR quotes. Those are always very strong to start the round with. But as long as it's somewhat interesting and it's not from someone who is just completely and utterly unqualified, it'll work out. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit F7 on our keyboard to make our quote in this big, bold font. Everything that you put that isn't from a piece of cited evidence is pretty much going to go into this F7 key. This is how I use it to mark that it's my own words. Of course, the quote itself isn't my own words, but the quote is in this kind of weird area where it's not necessarily the most important thing. It's not a cited piece of evidence, so it's okay to just put it into this F7 anyway. That's what's called a tagline, which we'll talk more about why it's called a tagline later. But once you have your quote in, we are then going to transition to the topic itself. So I generally like to use this little fancy wording. Everything that I write here, of course, you don't have to use word for word. But if you want to pull my case as a direct template, I'm definitely okay with that. So I say, it is because I agree with the words of, this is a British economist, so the British economist William Beveridge. Most people here will just put, thus I must affirm or negate the resolution, but I also like to kind of explain the quote a little bit. So it's because I agree, I'm going to get rid of with the word just for sake, it's because I agree with the British economist William Beveridge that unemployment is a vital threat. My H keeps working. To our society, that I must affirm the resolution which states resolved. And then you're going to state the resolution here. It'd be good if I spelled resolved right. United. I'm very clearly not the fastest typer. That's why we'll be copying and pasting most of this. Ought to provide a federal jobs guarantee. Hit caps lock again, whatever. So after that, we're then going to be moving on into our like general definitions. Personally, I don't think that definitions are super important in the round. A lot of people like to try and define every single term in the resolution. For instance, in this case, they would probably define ought, provide, and of course, federal jobs guarantee, because they believe they can once again get some tricky wording with the definition that'll make it have some deeper meaning to it. But personally, I think that that's completely unnecessary, and that the only thing we really need to define here is a federal jobs guarantee. In fact, in my own case, I didn't even technically define a federal jobs guarantee. I just said, as we see here, to clarify, a federal jobs guarantee is when the government ensures that they have access to a job, especially when they provide it. So we're just going to go there and give our little like quick definition. Now, if you do want to actually put in definitions from like Merriam-Webster and stuff, that's fine as well. I personally don't put a like actual citation in. I will literally just say, according to Merriam-Webster, ought is defined as a moral obligation, and then move on with my life. Once again, I think if people are going to try and challenge you and say that you're like breaking the rules because you don't cite your source on literally a like definition, that's completely unlike reasonable and unnecessary. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. But now that we have our definitions in, we're good to move on to our actual value and value criterion. You'll notice that I kept my introduction very short. I just wanted to give my little bit of style at the beginning with the quote and then move on to what we're talking about. And that's generally because I like to put a lot of evidence in my contentions, and therefore I have to cut something from somewhere. So I try and keep this part pretty short, but if you want to add a bit more to it and make it a bit more stylistic, that's fine. So afterwards, we are going to move on to our actual value and value criterion. So I'm just going to copy and paste all of this evidence as for my value and value criterion in, and we'll kind of go through and explain it. So we are going to, I'm going to use the F2 key to paste in this time. Notice how it keeps everything in normal text instead of actually putting it into what I actually copied, which some of it was bold, some of it was highlighted. I'm not actually going to do that for the sake of that's not what I want, but I just wanted to kind of show how that can help. So we then move on to our like transition into the value and value criterion. Obviously, this is going to differ based off what your actual value and value criterion is, but generally you want to have a little sentence here that kind of connects it. I always like this one because you can use this to apply to most values. As a resolution is a question of societal ethics, the value is blank. This one is especially good because literally society is like the root word of societal or social. So obviously, like there's that little extra connection there, but you can use it for pretty much any value. So then we go through and we actually have to define and justify what social justice is, or whatever your value might be. Once again, you can just explain this yourself, but I generally like to provide evidence to do so because like within a round, generally people aren't going to attack your specific evidence on your value and value criterion, which you can then use to like bite them later and be like, oh, well, they didn't attack this, which means that they concede and agree with it, which technically is true. If they don't attack your carded evidence, then you can use that to extend into the next speech, which is great. So now we're going to get into like a quick little mini like lesson here on how to actually get evidence into your speech, because obviously, you know, it's not quite what you're used to if you're thinking of it's going to be like writing an argumentative essay for your English class. So in debate, we have a couple things that we need to do. First, we need to obviously get our citation, and this is pretty much what you're expected. You can just use like an MLA format or whatever you want. Personally, I like to write mine myself, and I use this quick like little mnemonic device to help me, because you need author, qualifications, title, publishers, date, and then URL. This one doesn't have a URL because I didn't actually get it from a website, but generally it will. So the like little mnemonic device I use to remember is all quick tigers promptly devour unicorns, which sounds like the dumbest thing ever, and like it's not going to help you remember it at all. But that's what I thought when I first heard it my freshman year, and now 3 years later, it's still stuck in my head. So I can definitely help you remember that if you're trying to think of what all you need to put into your citation. In fact, when I was trying to list them off in my head, I had to go through the device and be like, what letter does it coordinate with? Um, so you're simply going to go through and put that. And of course, there's like specific ways you're supposed to format it. But as long as you get all the information in there, that's all that really matters. So going through this little citation, we see the name, Robinson Matthew, his qualifications, he has a PhD, the title of the article, what is social justice, where it comes from, the Department of Government and Justice Studies at Appalachian State University. And then our date, 2015, November 5th. And yeah, like I said, we didn't have a URL. So that's our citation in there. What most people will do, and what you'll see pretty commonly whenever people like actually want to read their source in round, as you'll see like down here, we generally are going to highlight what we actually want to say. And I'll move on to like how we decide that in a second. So what most people will do, since they want to read the author, is they'll highlight their last name and the year, because that's all that people generally read. I try and be a little bit more stylistic with it, as I do with pretty much everything in my case. So you'll see I put like writes Professor Robinson from Appalachian State, because to me that's a lot more persuasive and just sounds nicer than saying Robinson 2015 and then reading off the piece of evidence. I would actually greatly recommend doing that whenever you cite your sources. But once again, this is what you're more commonly going to see with just the name and the date. So if that's what you want to opt for, that's certainly your choice. So, but beyond that, once we have the citation in, we can actually go into doing what's called cutting the card. And the reason we have to do this is because, like, this is a lot of information right here, right? This would probably take me, like, I don't know, we'll say 30 seconds to read. And that's being, like, generous, keeping it pretty low. And that's already a 12th of my speech for just this one card. In this case, I have, like, a bunch of cards. See, there's just 3 right there for framework. And we haven't even gone into the contention. So clearly, we see that we can't be reading all of this evidence. Like, we simply don't have the time. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut it down. And the way we do that is we try and decide what we actually need to say, and we highlight those words, and we're not going to read anything else. So looking right here, we see that, there's obviously this big spiel, but I was able to cut it down to this, which probably could be read in 10 to 15 seconds. That's cutting it halfway down. And this card isn't even like necessarily very small. There are a lot of cards that are cut way shorter and that are way longer, like before being cut. So very clearly, this is like essential for debate. Now, on to actually how you do it. It is just somewhat of a learned skill, as obviously, like, I can only tell you so much besides cut down words that you don't need. But a couple like quick notes that can help you is that obviously, like, there are just going to be some sentences that you cut out completely, but beyond that, you just got to find what really doesn't like support your argument or is largely unnecessary, and without like necessarily changing the meaning of the sentence. So this little bit right here, support further human rights, like, although important, it doesn't really further what I'm trying to get at with this piece of evidence, so I just got rid of it. And you can even cut really small things, even if it only saves a fraction of a second. They add up as you do more and more of them. So, for instance, fair allocation of community resources versus fair allocation of resources doesn't really make that big of a difference. So why don't we just cut out that little community part? And then we save a little bit of time. Of course, whenever we have big lists like this is a great place to cut, because all of this right here is saying the exact same thing. It's just getting a bit more specific. So if you don't need those specifics, cut them out. So that's generally the basic idea of cutting, is just try and get out things that don't actually further your argument. And like I said, it definitely takes some time to get into. And even now, like, sometimes I'll be looking at stuff and I'll be like, I don't want to cut this just because it's all so good. But you got to learn when to make those cuts and what's actually truly essential to get your case out. Because when it comes down to it, you're always just going to have 6 minutes to give that affirmative case, and you can only say so many things in that time. So you'll definitely get a hang of it over time. So anyway, once you're done with your card, you're going to generally provide a bit of analysis explaining what the card says. Here, it's pretty self-explanatory because I'm just saying that social justice is good, and there's not really much more I need to say about it. So I move into my value criterion. And this is going to be roughly the same setup. I get my little spiel that gets us into the value criterion. Then I state what it is. Then I define it using my card. Just a quick reminder, you don't actually have to use a card. I just personally like to, so keep that in mind. And then we move on to something a little bit different. This time, instead of simply defining it, I actually provide a reasoning for why the value criterion is the best. Most people definitely do not do this, but it has certainly won me some rounds this year, so I would greatly recommend it if you can. This specific card has actually been great for me. I reference it in my rebuttal speeches a lot. So you can do that just as a little backup to make sure that you can go into your next speech and make some better arguments about why your value criterion is the best. But once again, it's going to be under the same sort of evidence structure where you say, here's what I'm going to argue. That's what's called the tagline. It's your claim. If you remember when we talked about parts of argument, we first said that we need to start an argument with a claim. So that's what our tagline is. And then you're going to go through and highlight what is important. Additionally, if you're starting your evidence, the way you can highlight things a lot faster is by using more functions up here. You'll notice that mine are both underlined and highlighted. So if you hit F10, it'll do a bold and underlined. That's generally what I like to do. These cards don't have the bold on them, but it's roughly the same. And then F11 will highlight it. So that's a nice just little way to keep it that way. And then once you're done with all your bold and highlighting, because generally, all of this is going to be in big text, right? It's going to be what you normally write it out, but we want to make the text that we're not going to read small, so it's not taking up a bunch of space. So then we'll hit this shrink button. It'll make everything that isn't highlighted and underlined shrunken. To do that again, since there wasn't a whole lot of big text. See how this is all big now. And when I hit shrink, it's all a little bit smaller. So that's just a little nice thing to help condense your text as well. So once we have that done, we're going to be done with our value criterion. And we can finally move on to the contentions. Now, personally, I'm going to copy and paste the rest of the case in, but we're only going to talk through one contention because it's pretty self-explanatory. So let's get that contention in real quick. All right. Personally, I'm going to look at the second contention as it is a bit shorter, and since it's the end of the case, there's a couple things that change at the end since, we're just kind of trying to wrap up right at the very end. So you'll say, your contention, this is going to go under a hat. So you'll hit your F5 key because most of the time, it's small. You hit F5, it gets into this really big text. And whenever at the end of our case writing thing, when we're talking about a couple of extra tools of verbatim, we will point out why it's important that you put that into a hat. But then from this point forward, pretty much all you're going to do is you're going to make your claim, put that in a tag, state your author, and then have your card to support it. So for instance, my claim right here is I'm trying to set up the idea that simply because something is costly doesn't necessarily mean that it's completely useless. The whole point of this is that way I can undermine all the negative arguments talking about the economy. So I make my claim. I then cite my source. And then I go through and I put my evidence in. Then afterwards, you're going to want to put your little bit of analysis generally. This is something that a lot of people overlook, but I personally love doing it. So I have mine little bit right here. Therefore, even if the program isn't perfect, it provides your basic societal need. You can put a bit more in than that, but personally, that's all that I really think is necessary unless your card is hard to understand, in which case you might need to break it down for your judge a little bit. And then I move into my next tagline. The right to work is a basic human right. That's my claim. Then I have my author. Then I go through and have my card under it. Then beyond that, you're just going to keep on doing that over and over and over again until we're done with all your pieces of evidence that you think is necessary in order to prove your contention. My general contention here was a simple one, that work is a human basic right and that the federal jobs guarantee gives that to us. So my evidence has proven that it is a right and that the federal jobs guarantee solves for that right. So that's sufficient in order to make my claim. So then at the end, you're going to have your little bit of analysis. And then at the end of every contention, you want to tie it back to your value and value criterion. That way you can just give your judge a little reminder, hey, this is what we're doing. We're trying to achieve these big ideas, and I'm actually doing it. So that's what I did right here. Without it, we continue to further oppression and stray further from societal justice. Resisting oppression is my value criterion, and societal justice is my value. So in that quick little sentence, I connected it back to those two big ideas and said, hey, just a friendly reminder, this is what we're looking at in the round. And then from that point, you can either move on to your next contention, or if you are doing, if this is your last contention of the case, you'll just put the little spiel to end your speech. I always like to say, like, thus it is for all these reasons I urge about an affirmation, or it is for all these reasons and many more that I must affirm the resolution, or whatever you want to say. And then if you're on the affirmative side, say that you now stand open for cross-examination. And if you're on the negative side, say, I will now move on to my opponent's case, because obviously your speech isn't done yet. You still need to go and address what your opponent just said in their speech, but you're still done with the case, and you want to make sure you make it clear to your judge that you are now moving on to addressing your opponent's case and you are done with your speech or your case. So, but otherwise, that was very quick, obviously, but those are like the basic formattings of a case. We're just going to quickly go through some really nice things that Verbatim gives us. And beyond this stuff, there's not really too much more I want to talk about, but there's a couple big things. So we already talked about a lot of these. But just to kind of show again what we're talking about, F2 is our paste button that makes it to where it gets rid of all like the formatting. That's personally really like good if you're going to be copying and pasting from a website or something, because then you're going to have all their formatting there and you can just get rid of it all at once instead of having to go through and change it all yourself. F3 is your condense key, which is really useful. So let's say that I am pulling from a PDF, because I frequently do that, especially if you use the briefs. Your text is going to be really like broken up, and there's going to be random breaks in the line there because the PDF page isn't the same length as your page, but it still doesn't have it as one big chunk of text. It has each line as a chunk. So there's going to be, we'll say, one right here after the word employment, and there's going to be one right here after the word that, and one after mathematics or whatever. It's going to be all over the place, obviously, and sometimes you'll even be cutting words in half. So we are going to normally have to go through and hit the the backspace everywhere and get it all together. But instead, Verbatim gives us a little tool that'll help us with that. If we highlight a chunk of text with like breaks in it, and we hit, wow, this is a lot of text here. I forgot that we were using the case. But if you hit F3, then it'll make it all one big chunk of text with no breaks in the line. See, obviously this one is a small one here just because it's the URL and it's longer than one line, but now it's all one big chunk of text. Obviously, this was a super big chunk of text that you wouldn't normally use it for, but it's really useful if you're citing evidence, because then you can just have it all together and you can go through and highlight what you need, and it's all in one place. So F3 is super helpful. We already talked about F4 a little bit. That makes our hat. So I even spelled my last name wrong. Only one L went through. Then we have our hat. So this would be our like contentions. Then we have our block. We only use blocks if you're actually, surprise, surprise, writing blocks. So that doesn't go in your case itself. But it'd be like A2 poverty, and then you would like give your block about poverty. You have our tagline, which is for our general claims and our own words. And then we don't use cite too much, but we have underline, emphasis, and highlight, all for cutting cards. So if we want to read this, I generally don't use underline because I just go straight to emphasis. So you'll emphasize and highlight. And if you want to like undo any of this, you can just highlight it and hit F12, which is the clear button, and it'll all go back to normal text. This works for like this as well. So if I hit that, it's back to normal text. So those are like the big keys we can use here. Oh, the other big one is that you can use the shrink one, which we already talked about a little bit. But if we want to like read just this part of the text, then we can hit shrink and everything around it will become a lot smaller, which makes it a lot easier just to read what we want to read. So that one is super helpful as well. Also, just as a fun little thing, you can change your like text highlight color so it'll automatically highlight in different. I don't want to highlight anymore. It'll automatically highlight in different colors. So if you want to highlight in like blue, then you can do that. I actually really like highlighting in blue. It's hard to read it if you print off the case, but if you're just going to read off your computer, it's really pleasant. But that's just like a little fun thing. And then otherwise, the other really big things that Verbatim has, the two things that I use constantly are the navigation key. You're probably wondering why we like format everything this way, because it makes it super easy to read the case. So whenever we look at this, this is a little ugly because we've put in 3 different things. So let me get rid of all of this real quick. That way it's just my case. So whenever your case is done, it's going to look like this, and it's all under different headings. So we have our biggest heading, which is that of our case name. So whenever we're ready to look at that case, we'll hit this little arrow, and then we can see our like intro and value criterions, and then our contentions. So, if we want to get to our part where we talk about the value, then we'll hit here and bam. Now we're to the part that we're talking about, or this is our value criterion. But now we're to the part where we're talking about that. And if we want to get to our next piece of evidence from Velasquez, then we hit this and bam, we're right there. But then if we want to get to our contentions, we also have these here. But if we want to get to the specific cards under them, then bam, we hit this little arrow, and then the actual like individual pieces of evidence are there. So that's why this is super good, because let's say that you're in cross-examination and your opponent is like, hey, on your first contention, you had that piece of evidence from Asia in 2012. What was that all about? So you can just be like, oh, and hit the key, and then now your evidence is pulled up and you have it right there to read off of. So it makes it really quick to navigate. This is especially important whenever you're writing blocks, because in a block file, you could have hundreds of pages worth of evidence. And obviously you can't just scroll through that, but you can look over here and it'll say like A2 poverty, and you can just hit the A2 poverty button and bam, you're at what you need to be working with. So that's probably the most useful thing about Verbatim, is that it just makes it easy to navigate. The other one I personally really like is simply this read tool, because now it's like pages almost whenever you're going through your case. So whenever I get to the bottom of this and I'm done reading it, I can hit the right key and then bam, we're at the more information. And you can just keep on doing it, and it makes it super easy to read your case in round, as opposed to the way you have to do it with like going down, and hitting the down key only like moves one line down. So it's definitely not favorable. But this is a great way to read your case in round. So anyway, that's pretty much the most important information for Verbatim. Obviously, we just really quickly dash through writing a case, and part of the reason for that is because your case is definitely going to want to feel like your own. I have a novice who is doing great right now, but she always makes me laugh because her case totally has the workings of my own like figures of speech, since I was the one who taught her. But whenever she starts putting her own like wording into it and it becomes her own voice, she definitely was more successful with those cases, because she knows how she wants to say those words and how she wants to put emphasis on different parts and all those different things that come with writing your own case. So while this is definitely a good format to work from, personally, case writing is one of my strengths. So I do feel like, this is a good like basis to work from. You still don't want to put too much emphasis on just following someone else's work, because that's going to hurt you in the long run. So that's why I didn't want to put too much work into every little thing that we said. So, but otherwise, I hope that you were able to better understand the basics of case writing and the reasons why you definitely need Verbatim. A lot of people don't use it, but personally, I didn't start off using it, and it has made my life in debate so much easier. But otherwise, there's not too much more to say about the formatting. So I hope you're able to learn from this, and I hope you, as always, good luck in all your rounds.